Hey everybody, welcome to Bean to Bar World. So I'm going to talk to you today about 10 tempering tips that should help you when you're tempering chocolate at home. And this is specific more to the marbling method of tempering. Okay, so let's get started. Tip number 1, don't overheat your chocolate. A lot of people will leave their bowl of chocolate on the bain-marie and it's, shooting out steam. It's getting really hot. They're forgetting about it. Or maybe it's in the microwave and you're microwaving it for too long at once and it starts to overheat it, maybe burn it. You want to be very careful. Especially in the microwave, you could burn the chocolate. Basically, you're burning the sugars and the proteins in there. And in a bain-marie, you might find that it might get really thick. So especially with white and milk chocolate, some people will be melting it. Like, oh, it's almost melted. And then all of a sudden it gets really chunky. And they're like, oh, it's not melted. It actually is. You're overheating it. And that's why it's getting chunky. So for dark chocolate, anywhere from 45 to 50. Milk chocolate around 45. And white chocolate, maybe 40 to 45. So all the crystals in the chocolate, there's about 5 or 6 different crystals in your chocolate. And they need to be all melted out before you can start your tempering. And bringing it to these temperatures will ensure that your chocolate has none of these crystals, so you can start from scratch and get some good crystals going. But if your chocolate is too hot, a few things will happen. One, yeah, you could burn some of the sugars. It could get really clumpy. Also, you're going to be overheating it, which means it's going to take longer to temper, which means you might not have as nice a temper. When it comes to tempering, especially if you're using a marble piece of granite, something like that to temper on, if your chocolate is too hot, everything's going to get too warm. So if you want to do a few temperings with that marble, if all your chocolate is in the 60s or 70s, really too hot, then everything's going to heat up and it's going to take longer for things to happen. They're not going to happen as well as you want them to. So make sure you don't overheat your chocolate. Tip number 2, equipment matters. So here's a few tools that when I'm tempering on marble, it'll make your life so much easier. So a metal or glass bowl, okay? The plastic doesn't cool down the chocolate fast enough. It kind of holds in some of that heat. So I don't recommend plastic. If it's all you have, use it. But if you do have some metal or glass bowls, I prefer those. A rubber spatula is really helpful. I've seen people temper with wooden spoons, and what happens is you're not getting the chocolate around the edges. I want to constantly see clean edges as I'm mixing it. And mixing it, yeah, it's going all over the edges. You want to use the edges to help cool it down. But then you want to bring it all in to the center of the chocolate in the bowl. And what happens if you have streaks of chocolate on the side that are not being tempered in with the rest of the chocolate, they're kind of out of temper basically. And then eventually when you're pouring it into your mold, you get some of that chocolate. It can end up getting streaks on your molds, on your chocolate bars because of that. So you really want to use a good rubber spatula to scrape all that chocolate and mix it in really well. Wide metal scrapers. These are good for so many things in chocolate, but especially on the marble. These are your tools for tempering chocolate. I use the big one to throw it out, to kind of spread it out, to bring it back in, and then I use another to scrape the sides and keep doing that, or even to put them into the bowl. So wide metal scrapers, you can get this at the hardware store. It doesn't have to be a kitchen specific store. Just make sure you wash them really well. And laser thermometer. Laser thermometers are so helpful. A lot of people have probe thermometers at home where you stick in the probe and you're waiting for it to read. When you're tempering chocolate, things happen really quickly. That might be fine at the beginning when you're melting it, but when you're getting into the crucial stage of whether the chocolate is a good temperature or not, you want to get a quick reading. So just make sure that you're constantly moving the chocolate in the bowl with one hand, and then the other hand you're taking the temperature of the chocolate, because this only takes the surface temperature. So I don't stir it and then take the temperature. I take the temperature while I'm folding and stirring the chocolate to get an accurate reading. All right, tip number 3, cool ambient temperature. So you want to make sure that your room is cool. If you don't have air conditioning, think about maybe tempering in the morning or in the evening if it's too warm where you are, or maybe the garage, or maybe a basement. You want the temperature to be ideally below 20 degrees Celsius. If it's above that, it's going to be a bit harder, and if it's 25 or more, you're going to have a really hard time tempering your chocolate. So the cooler, the better. Tip 4, clean molds. I can't tell you how many times people don't realize that their molds are not actually clean. And when I say clean, I don't mean dirty in the sense of bacteria or old food or filthy in that sense. I mean a chocolate mold needs to be polished and shiny with nothing inside here when you're putting in your new chocolate. It can even be a mold like this, and I would consider this a clean mold. So you might see some chocolate on the sides, on the top. You're always going to have that if you're scraping. That's okay. But you want to make sure the cavities of your mold are clean. And so you can clean them by using cotton pads. So you can grab makeup cotton pads from the pharmacy, or you can use a lint-free, non-abrasive, very soft cloth to wipe down the molds. So let's say you pop out all your chocolates or whatever was in there, and you just kind of look into the light, and I can see already, it's hard to see on the camera, but I can see that there's release marks, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab my cloth, rub it in there like this, nice and firm. You can keep it on the counter. Just get it nice and firm, and the friction and your hand will warm it up, and it will clean that off. And then I hold it up to the light, and I can see marks here and there. Sometimes that marks might be on the back. Don't worry about those. But if I see a mark and I wipe it and it doesn't go away, it's probably in the back, so I'll forget it. But as a beginner, it doesn't hurt to polish your molds with a nice dry cloth. Some people use 99% rubbing alcohol. Some people have issues with that. You can use vodka as well. I've used vodka sometimes, a little bit damp. So generally, I just use dry cloths or pads. But if I find there's a lot of cocoa butter on there, or let's say some ganache or caramel got on there for some reason in a few cavities, then I'll use the alcohol to wipe that off. You kind of dampen your cloth or your pad with a little bit of alcohol, just a little bit. And then I'll go with a dry cloth after that sometimes and just wipe it off. So some people say that the alcohol is what makes it really shiny. That's not true. What makes your chocolate really shiny are 3 things. Good clean mold, no release marks, no leftover cocoa butter, nothing like that, very clean. A good temper. And if you do color your molds, if you spray your molds with cocoa butter color, or even just plain cocoa butter, a little spray of extra cocoa butter, that'll make it even more shiny as well, okay? So clean your molds, make sure there's no marks, no cocoa butter, no bits of chocolate. If there's a little bit of chocolate that got stuck, that broke off, I'll use a nice soft pad and kind of clip it off. Sometimes, let's say my cocoa butter didn't adhere to the chocolate for whatever reason, and there's a few molds that didn't release from, I might get a hairdryer and just warm it up quickly, get a dry pad, wipe that off, get an alcohol pad, wipe it, get a dry one again, wipe it, and it should be really, really nice and clean. And if your molds are too dirty, you will have to wash them. So manufacturers say, a lot of people say, don't wash your molds or don't use soap on your molds. You have to sometimes. And especially if they've been used a lot and there's just too much built up on them, you do need to wash them. So the manufacturers say do not use detergents on the molds, but you kind of have to, because cocoa butter is a fat-based, chocolate is a fat-based product. You need that to lift off the fat. So when you're washing your molds, you usually get a sink, really, really hot water. Again, hot water is really going to help release those fats. A very dilute amount of soap in your water there, and wash them. Again, this is up to you. I've worked in places for many years where we had only a certain amount of molds, and we had to switch between dark and white chocolate, and we had to wash them. And so every week or every other week, some molds were getting washed, and I was always, always, always for years still able to get nice shiny chocolates. So I'm not saying it's not true that you shouldn't use soap, but it's not the end of the world, and it's okay to use it sometimes. Just make sure that you rinse really, really well after washing them. And actually, let me go back because we're still on cleaning molds. So you soak your molds in your hot water, you wipe them off with something very soft, you rinse them really, really well, and then when you pull them out of the water, you shake off the excess water, and you have to dry the cavities right away. Otherwise, you're going to get watermarks inside your cavities. Usually I tap out the excess water from the back. The sides and the back I'm not too worried about. Let that air dry overnight. But the cavities, as soon as you pull it out of the rinse, dry them right away. Because if you start getting the water from the washing machine or whatever drying on your molds, then you're going to get spots, and then you're going to have to use the alcohol and the pads to wipe that off. And it's just going to be more work. Tip 5, cool quickly and move constantly. So when you're tempering your chocolate, okay, if it's on your marble, you want to constantly be spreading it, bringing it back together. Spreading it, bringing it back together. Don't multitask. Don't walk away from it when it's on the marble. It's going to solidify too much. When it's in the bowl, so if you're tempering on the marble, usually you don't want to bring it down too much on the marble because the bowl will finish it off. So usually 33, 32 is what I'll bring it to on the marble, and then throw it in the bowl. And then once it's in the bowl, constantly stir, 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 taking your temperature, things like that, but constantly move it around. And cooling it down quickly. You don't want it to plateau, okay? So sometimes, let's say my chocolate is around 32, and it's just staying there too long, I feel. It's not dropping like it should. Maybe the room is, I can feel it's kind of warm. Throw it in the fridge for 10, 15 seconds, depending on how much chocolate you have. It's a huge bowl, maybe 20 seconds. But throw it in the fridge with the bowl, with the spoon, bring it out, stir it, push all that chocolate to the sides of the bowls, because the sides of the bowl are now cool, and it's going to help bring it down. And you can drop your chocolate 1 degree or more just by doing that. So if you see it plateauing, because if you were to pour it back on the marble, it's just going to cool it down way too much. So sometimes throwing in the fridge for 10 seconds can help. Tip number 6, temperature is only a guide. So we talk a lot about temperatures. And when you're melting the chocolate to start, that's usually a good 50 degrees for dark, 45 for milk. That's a good temperature range. But when it comes to what temperature does it have to be to start using it, to start pouring it in my mold, there is no set temperature, I'm sure to say. If people have told you that it has to be this, that's not true. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on the chocolate itself, the manufacturer, the process of how they made it, how much cocoa butter they added or didn't add, how much sugar is in there, the particle size of the cacao solids. All that will impact how it sets and what temperatures they set. So usually the package of the chocolate that you get will have instructions of how to temper it. I suggest trying to use those as reference points first, because they usually have an idea of what temperature you want to bring your chocolates down to. But again, it really matters more of what the chocolate is doing. The temperature that it sets at, or that it cools to before you pour it into your molds, is also dependent on the method you used, the ambient temperature. If it's a really hot day, I'm going to bring it down lower than if it's really cold. It's just the way it works with chocolate. Which brings me to tip number 7, temper checks. Temper checks. I'm not talking about temperature checks. I'm talking about temper checks. So while your chocolate is in that crucial stage of 33, 32, 31, 30, you want to always take those temperatures. But when it gets to about 32, 31, 30, especially if you're a beginner, you can't do enough temper checks. And what that is as you're stirring and mixing your chocolate, checking the temperatures, you get a spoon, back of a spoon or a knife, dip it in the chocolate a little bit, set it aside, and you're going to do that every 0.5 degrees. So 32, 31.5, 31, 30.5. Keep doing those temper checks. As a beginner, you can't do too many temper checks. And what you're going to do is, while you're stirring and taking the temperature, you're going to look at the spoons in front of you and see how they're setting. So you might see that the 32, the first one is still not setting. At 31.5, the second one is setting kind of slowly. At 31, the third temper check starting to set, but you see some streaks in there. At 30.5, your temper check is setting quite quickly. I don't see any streaks, or maybe just a little. So if I see a few streaks, it might just mean I just need to stir it a little bit. If it's in that temperature range of 31, 30, 29, that's a good range. And if the temper doesn't look perfect, if it's still kind of streaky, sometimes all it takes is just a bit of love, just a bit of stirring. Constantly stir that chocolate, and that can get a really nice temper. So I've poured chocolate that's 31 degrees, 30 degrees, 28.5 degrees if it's really hot sometimes. It really depends on the chocolate, the ambience, a lot of things. So don't worry too much about that final temperature. Worry more about how it's setting. And you can see how it's setting by looking at the temper checks. So you can't take too many temper checks. And you know what? You have all these spoons of chocolate on them. After you just chip them all off, throw them into your next batch, melt them down, and do it again. You're not wasting anything. You really, really have to get used to looking at how the temperature is setting, okay? That's how a lot of people in the industry do it. You know, they're not going to pour 20, 30 molds and realize later, oh, the temper wasn't that great, right? Because the temperature is only a guide. What really matters is how it's setting. Does the chocolate look very shiny and smooth, or is it kind of spotty? Is it kind of streaky, right? So temper checks don't lie, but the temperatures can lie, okay? Tip number 8, work quickly. So this is obvious, but it's hard. And when I'm watching people sometimes on the tutoring, it's like you want to just go in there and be like, do that faster. Because they're, pouring their chocolate like this. And, oh, where's my scraper? And they're going to go look for it. And it's like you can't, when you're tempering your chocolate and everything's ready to go, you have to have everything with you. Okay, so you got to work quickly. Have everything within arm length. Your temper checks, your cloths, your whatever you need. Make sure it's all here. And just go, go, go. Pour, pour, pour. Tap, tap, tap. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Just get it done. Just finish it. Don't worry about like doing a mold, bringing it to the fridge, coming back. No, just pour all your chocolates, tap them, scrape them, and then you can start dealing with that. Especially at home. You're usually not doing a lot of molds. Just if the chocolate's in temper and you have a beautiful temper check, use it for whatever you need to. And then later you worry about the rest. Tip number 9, tap and vibrate your molds. So a lot of times if my chocolate's on the thicker side and let's pretend this is a ladle. I get my chocolate, I pour it into here. I'm tapping it on the counter as I'm pouring. Especially if I have square or rectangle cavities. You really want it to get into those little crevices or a bar mold. So as I'm pouring, I'm tapping. Some people buy what's called a vibrating table, and all that is basically you put your mold on there and it vibrates, and you could pour your chocolate while it's vibrating. But if you don't have that, they can be a bit pricey sometimes. You can just bang it on the counter, shake it back and forth. Do that while you're pouring, and then after it's all in, and after you kind of scrape the excess off, boom, boom, boom. Tap it on your counter, shake it around a bit. And what that's going to do is many things. It's going to get rid of the air pockets and the air bubbles. It's also going to help keep your surfaces nice and clean. So sometimes when you're pouring bars, for instance, right, they're very thin. People have all these weird lines and streaks. But if you vibrate while you're doing it and tap it, less chance of those things showing up, those kind of drizzles from the ladle and things like that. And it ensures also even distribution as well. So especially for a bar, if you want to pour into a bar, sometimes you scrape it, and so all the chocolate, you can't see it so well, but all the chocolate's kind of shifted to one side. But if you shake it around, tap it, it's going to even out, so you have a very even distributed bar of chocolate. Tip number 10, refrigerate. So I'm surprised how many people don't realize they have to refrigerate their chocolate after they've poured it into the mold. And there might be people that get away with not doing it. Maybe their room is nice and cool. But sometimes they complain that their chocolate isn't super shiny. It's not releasing that well. It's solidifying, but it's not amazing. And that's because you got to really chill it. So after you pour your chocolate, you've tapped it out, you've scraped it, set it down. Maybe you do a few of those. And then you throw them in the fridge. When I put my molds to set on the counter in the fridge, usually I put them this way. Some people put them this way, which is fine, but you might get a really thick rim around the bottom. Sometimes you want a thick rim, and sometimes you don't. So if you don't, usually this way is good. But you want to be sure that there's not too much chocolate in there, because then all the chocolate's going to pour. But Another tip for another time. But put it in the fridge after. It's okay sometimes if they kind of set while they're out. So if you're doing a few things, if you touch them and they're still kind of sticky and tacky, that's okay. If they completely set, especially if you have color coded inside, like colored cocoa butter, you got to really throw it in the fridge right away. Don't wait too long, okay? You get a better adherence to the cocoa butter, and you'll get a better shine and temper in the chocolate. Don't put it in the freezer. So what happens is when you're tempering your chocolate, you're building up the beta 5 crystals, the good crystals. And putting it in the fridge accelerates the buildup of those crystals. But if you freeze them, you're not actually building crystals. You're just slowing down all the molecules in the chocolate, and you're not actually allowing it to crystallize properly. And so you're breaking that temper. The only time you would put your finished chocolate mold in the freezer is, let's say you've set them, you put them in there. Let's say you fill your cavities, you cap them, and you go to take out your bonbons, and they're not releasing. There's some that are just completely stuck. It could be that your temper wasn't that great, and you'll find out later. But something you can do to get them out is put it in the freezer for a few minutes, and then take it out and gently tap it on your counter, and they should pop right out. If they still don't come out, put it in a bit longer, take it out. By that time, the chocolate is already crystallized, already set. That freezing, what's going to do, it's going to basically shock it, shrink it away, release from the mold, and it'll pop out. And whether it's a nice temper and they pop out and they look good and you can use them, or if it's a bad temper, it's a good way to kind of pop them out and get them out. Otherwise, you're going to have to melt it, and it's going to be a mess. So always, always, always refrigerate your chocolate, bars, cavities, whatever, after you pour them. So hopefully some of these tips have helped you. Hopefully they will ensure that you have a better temper. If you still have some questions, if you've tried some of these things, sometimes you might need a tutoring session. So you can book chocolatier tutoring sessions with me, and I can help you through it at home. Sometimes I see that people, they understand what I'm saying. They think they're doing it, but they're not. So sometimes you need like that second pair of eyes to kind of say, oh, like you're not actually stirring it well, or that's sitting out too long, things like that. And that's what the tutoring is there to help you for. So you might need that. But if you have more questions, if you have more issues tempering, feel free to send me a line. Check out the question drop. So beantobarworld.com/question drop. And those question drops are for these videos. The more questions you give me, the more topics I'll have to talk about, and the more I can help you with your issues. Well, thank you, everybody, and I'll see you again soon.